So let's look at what we've got in store for you today. We're on to our fifth session, perhaps a little bit less intense now than previous sessions. We've covered the groundwork on our core language, Java, and some of the core principles we've been discussing. And now we're getting closer to the core of agile development, particularly test-driven development. And today's topic we're calling test-driven development 2. It's our second look at the core test principles. This will involve us reviewing briefly annotations in Java, something we haven't really seen so far too much of. That won't take us too long. We're going to spend much of the next hour or so looking at some examples of best practice in test cases. Some very simple ones initially, getting to ones more interesting ones later on, and then we'll review in detail last week's lab, which saw you applying for the first time a fairly extensive set of tests. Before we get into that, I'd just like to briefly review your assignment. Your assignment, as you know, is specified here. Siobhan will be discussing it again next week. But I just want to remind you that its due date is coming up in a few weeks' time. And also just a little bit on what we mean by these grading spectrum, which I'm looking at here. The purpose of this table is to give you an idea about how we will grade the assignment. It does not mean that you need to attempt everything at the outstanding range. Okay, in fact, if you're already studying other modules in this master's program, it mightn't be a good use of your time to go for outstanding in one module if it neglects others. So it's up to you really how far you wish to go. Outstanding would be rare. Excellent, we'd feel everybody should have a shot at. And if you've other commitments, or perhaps if you're new to Java, good would be fine initially. Also, you could proceed higher up one of the columns than the other. You might go all the way on core features, but perhaps only so far on build systems. Or you might go fully to the outstanding in tests, but maybe only get up as far as good in the core features. So you will be graded according to the features you attempted. I think Siobhan is going to discuss this again briefly next week with you. Okay, our topic then this week is to focus on test-driven development and look in particular at some interesting examples. I'm going to start though by reviewing one last feature of Java we haven't discussed in too much detail yet, and that's annotations. Annotations weren't always in the language. They were added about 10 years ago or so, and they are essential to developing unit tests, so we should review them at least briefly. Annotations allow us to incorporate into a program metadata. That is information about the program as opposed to actual running code affecting the behavior of the program itself. It's used largely to target other programs which may be analyzing our code. So in our case, we're using annotations to help drive the unit testing framework and test runner we are using currently. So it's not part of the core logic, it is extra information, usually intended for tools. And you can annotate a whole variety of aspects of a Java class. We can annotate classes, fields, methods, and even other program elements. And the annotations look like this here. @ symbol introduces an annotation. And once we've introduced the annotation, we must usually indicate the name of the annotation. And there may optionally be parameters. In this case, we're annotating the method hashcode, and we're also annotating the method toString. Two annotations appearing in this code fragment, and you may have seen this in some of the labs to date. This override annotation, in fact, has no real effect on your program. It's entirely intended to help the IDE or the compiler error check your program. In particular, it was introduced to make it explicit that you're overriding a base class field And if for some reason you perhaps misspelt the field, maybe you said toString lowercase instead of uppercase, then the override annotation will ensure that you were getting a warning or even an error, depending on your settings, fairly early in the cycle, so it wouldn't be too misleading. Other annotations like deprecated, you may have seen those occasionally. This would be used possibly to indicate we're using a feature that is no longer going to be supported in the future. We've seen override already, and we've been using this one once or twice just to keep our compilation process fairly clean, particularly where we're using some features that are not easily implemented without incurring some ROS from the compiler. So we want to suppress those very occasionally for specific purposes. In JUnit, it used to not require annotations. So this was a version of JUnit from the past. We discussed some of this last week. In this case, we're extending from a test case class, and then we're calling each of our methods by a name, like setup or teardown, or known names, or we're calling them test, like test order or test order 2. This is fine, and you can still use unit testing 3 framework, but unit testing 4 gives us something a little bit more convenient. I'm just noticing that Krish is having some issues with audio. Anybody else struggling with audio? My connection here seems pretty good. I don't think I'm seeing any other issues from other participants. People just chiming in there to audio is good for me. Usually, Krish, things will settle down after a period, maybe 5 or 10 minutes when you come on to Adobe Connect. It's just a function of equalization taking place across the network. Okay, I'm looking now at unit testing in JUnit 4, and we're seeing the annotations in place here. Before and after, this means we're going to be running these 2 tests before each individual test. And then here are our individual tests annotated using this simple @test. It's convenient because we can maybe comment out those annotations if you want to take out a test, or we can, without having to interfere with the test case itself. The annotations do give us some additional features. One of these is testing with exceptions. And here I'm using a simple test that I'm expecting to generate an exception. This should generate an exception, in which case I'm catching it here and verifying the exception occurred. In JUnit 4, we can just introduce an annotation which allows us to specify that we want an exception, saying exception, it's an error. So it's a slightly more convenient mechanism. And we're seeing an example here of annotation with a parameter, expected equals runtime class. Now, we haven't discussed exceptions in detail yet. They will be the subject of next week's class, so we're kind of skipping over them a little bit, although we will be seeing them once or twice in today's examination. These are a complete list of the annotations. We've after class and after, before and before class, ignore. These are all additional ones to the ones I've just looked at. And we also have parameters, run with, suite classes, and test. So there's a higher order organization of tests available in JUnit, organizing tests into suites, and then these suites can be run, which may be aggregations of multiple test cases or collections of test classes. We're not really using it, but where you have more substantial test infrastructure, you might be wanting to separate out your tests into multiple suites. For instance, a suite that would run quickly, maybe run periodically, maybe every time you do a commit or an update. And maybe another suite could run longer, maybe overnight, if it's got more long-running tests or maybe requires some infrastructure. Now, testing keeps going, and quite a good few years of JUnit 4. It's the one that's most widely deployed. JUnit 5 has landed late last year and starting to make its way into the IDEs. Not currently bundled with Eclipse, though you can install it if you want. So we've stuck with 4 for the moment. There are some interesting additions and renaming going on here. We still keep with the basic test annotation, but some renaming to before class becomes before all, before becomes before each, and a few other new features associated with test suites and test factories. Again, we're not planning to cover those. You might be interested in investigating those in your own time. They're kind of fun to look at, and it's a nice, the origin of all the unit testing frameworks. So it's nice that they keep the framework alive and keep it chugging along. So that's our basic JUnit introduction, or annotations rather. We are only using annotations in the context of our unit testing framework. We're not really using them for much else in the classes, in the assignment and in the course itself proper. So we're happy enough just to keep it what we have so far. Okay, so these are annotations. I think